Hi, in this video we'll be discussing how to define datasets in Sharperlight and use those datasets in Power BI and Tableau. There'll be a number of steps and I think you should find them pretty straightforward. Just to outline the basic steps, we'll create a publish report in Sharperlight and then we'll get the link to that dataset that uses the RESTful service of Sharperlight, and we'll place that into Power BI. There's a number of different ways we can integrate data. One of them is the URL link, but another way is to use the Materialised Query in Sharperlight. This essentially creates a SQL table. We'll also discuss authentication, given that Power BI can talk to Sharperlight using Windows domain accounts. So that shows up as Windows, and it also has the ability to talk to Sharperlight in a mixed authentication mode, which in Sharperlight is the default. So you can have a non-Windows domain account getting the data out of Sharperlight. We'll also discuss how you can schedule jobs to refresh the data. For example, you could save a dataset as a CSV file in a OneDrive directory and have that uploaded to Power BI, or you could also use the Power BI Personal Gateway. A lot of these concepts also apply to Tableau. Okay, let's get started. So here I have a report in the web channel of Sharperlight, and what I want to do is take that dataset and push it up to Power BI so it appears like this. So the first step is to go to Sharperlight Publisher and create yourself a new publish report. I've already created one here and it's using SAP Business One. I'll just edit the query. Now this query could be over any system at all, but for this example I've chosen SAP Business One. Now the reason why you would use a query out of Sharperlight is because all the business intelligence that's built into your data model is going to be reused. For example, row level security, any other complications that may be happening in SQL. So you're not bypassing the policies in placed by the company. If I preview this data, you can see I've just got the accounts and an amount, and I've also created an expression to show the date and time that this query was run. I'm just using this so that we can identify when the dataset's been refreshed in Power BI or Tableau. So we've created the query, we'll press OK, and if we come across to the links tab, you'll see that there are a number of different links. The top one is a link to the report. So if I copy that and paste it into a browser, I should see something like this. So there's our report. This assumes that the service is running. If we look at some of the other links, you'll see that there's one called JSON. What this will do is call Sharperlight, and instead of giving you a report, it'll give you a JSON dataset. So let's copy that URL and paste it into the browser and see what comes back this time. You can see it's downloaded a file. If I open that file, you'll see that we've got the same report but now as a data set. This is the data that we're going to pass to Power BI in the first example. Let's start Power BI. On the initial screen we'll see the Get Data link. Let's click on that, and from the various data sources you can see that we have JSON here, but that's not the one we want. We want Other and Web, because we're getting data from the Sharperlight RESTful service, which is basically a URL link. So we'll click on Web and Connect. Next, Power BI will ask you for the link to the dataset, and because we've put it on the clipboard, there it is there. You can see that the link says JSON array in the middle here. If we were to change that to CSV, for example, we would get a CSV file format instead of a JSON array. Let's click OK here, and you see that Power BI has been able to grab the JSON data and put you into this edit screen here. If there was an issue with authentication, you would get a different display. At the moment, I've set up Sharperlight to use NTLM, which is Windows authentication. Power BI will use this by default. On the side, you can see there's the name of my query. Let's just change that to T6 for test number 6. The next step is to change this JSON array into a table. So come over to the left and click on To Table. We have a number of options here, but don't change anything, just press OK. There's another step now. Click on the icon on the right of the table and deselect Use Original Column Name as Prefix. Press OK, and you should see all the columns that are defined in the dataset, which is our account code, account name, amount, and the date time. You see the time at which I ran this was 14:46. Later on, I'll refresh that data and that date timestamp should change. Just to note that on the right hand side we have all the steps that we just completed, which was define the data source, convert to a table, and expand so that each one shows up as its own column. So if you make a mistake, you can delete these steps and repeat it. At this point, you can then change the data types if they're incorrect, or even rename the columns. But as everything is fine here, I'm just going to press Close and Apply. If I click on the data, you can see there's my data again. And if I go up to Report, I can start defining a report. I'm just doing something very simple for this example, so I'll select Table and then come across to my dataset, and I'll select the account and the amount and the time. I put the time in there so that we can see when it was been refreshed. Right, so we've integrated Sharperlight data into Power BI. Next step is to save this. So I'm calling this T6, and at this point it's still on my computer, but what I want to do is publish it up to the cloud. So I will go next, Publish, and Publish to Power BI. Okay, it's pushed it up into the cloud. Let's open that in the browser now, and we'll go to my workspace. There's the previous example. I'll just delete that and go to our new one, which is T6. So I'll just click on that, and there's our table, and the refresh time is, according to this, 3:57. Down the bottom here I have my data sets, so I'm just going to delete T5 and leave T6, which we just created earlier. On the menu on the side here, we've got a option to schedule a refresh. This depends on the personal gateway, which you can install yourself before you run this example. So let's click on Schedule Refresh, and the first thing we do is go to Gateway Connection, and you see that I've got my authentication already set up. If this hasn't been set up, you'll have a little warning message, in which case you just re-authenticate. Okay, and here's my scheduled refresh, and I can put in a date and a time of when I want that refresh to happen. In my case, I'm going to manually refresh it, so I don't need to change any of these options. So I'm going to go across this menu again, and in the menu there's a Refresh Now button. And what will happen is Power BI in the cloud will talk to your personal gateway, which will then talk to the Sharperlight RESTful service and get the data and refresh it and push it back up to the cloud. If the Sharperlight service was not running, then you'd probably get an error here saying that it couldn't refresh the data. But since we have the service running, it was able to get the data and pull it up into the cloud, and now our our date and time is 4 o'clock. So it's all worked. Okay, that's Power BI and the best way or the easiest way to push data up into Power BI. Now let's look at some other ways in which we can push data into Power BI using Materialised Queries. Let's go back to our published report that we created earlier and edit the query. Right click on the filter area and select Materialised Query. What this essentially does is take a snapshot of the query data and writes it to a SQL database table. I'll use the training Materialised Query database, and here's a Materialised Query that I created earlier. I'll just delete that and recreate it. Because I entered this window via Publisher, it still remembers the query that we were working with. So it's brought it up and essentially asking you, is this what you would like to take a snapshot of? Notice that this query has some relative period calculations. If you had dates in your filters, what you'd want to have is relative date filtering, so that if the dataset was refreshed, it could be the last month's data or the last year's data without any hard-coded dates. Let's press OK here, and it will then create the Materialised Query for us. Let's give this a name. I'm just double-clicking on it, and I'll call this Accounts. That's the code for this Materialised Query. And if we come across to the details, you can see that it's just giving the Materialised Query an arbitrary unique ID. So this one's ending in 5F. So I'll press OK, and that's being created for us. Now it's not necessary to do this, but let's have a look at the database that was created for us. Here's the Materialised Query database, and if we have a look in there, there's a table which ends in 5F, and if we select from that, there's our data. So the next step is to go to Power BI and say, instead of getting the data from a URL, let's get it from this table like you would any other table. This is the Power BI desktop client again, and we'll go back and select Get Data, and in this case we'll say it's a database and it's SQL Server, and we enter the database server name. So I've chosen the database and the table name, and now we've got our data set. So very similar to the URL, except that there's no conversion layers involved. And if we were to publish this up to the web, to the cloud, the steps for refreshing it would be pretty much the same. I'd like to talk about authentication now before we move on to Tableau. So if I edit the datasets in Power BI, we can click on Data Source Settings, and here's our URL address, and down the bottom here we've got Edit Permissions. If we have a look at here, by default it's using Windows Authentication, so let's just click on that and edit it. Now the reason why this worked is because Sharperlight can be set up to use Windows Authentication, and the service can accept your domain group or domain user and work with that. But there's a few things you need to know before this will work. The first is that your service needs to be set up for Windows Authentication. This would be done on the application server, and you can see that for that service you need to set it up for NTLM. That's what I'd normally use. By default, Sharperlight is set up to use default, which is a type of mixed authentication. It does Windows accounts and it does named users, for example someone's email address. Now you can use both of these in Power BI, but by default it wants the Windows authentication, so you need to make sure that your service is running as NTLM. If you do that, well then you can try out your user credentials, and if they've been set up in Site Setup, well then it's just going to go straight through. So that's the next step, is to go to Sharperlight Site Setup and just ensure that a group or your Windows domain account is trusted by that. So I'm in Site Setup, and if I go to Users, you can see there's my account, and because it's in Site Setup, when Power BI starts up, it's going to try my current account, and Sharperlight's going to be able to trust that because it's in here. Now, if you don't have Windows domain accounts and you're using some sort of named account, well, in that case, in Power BI, you need to use basic. So you would type in guest, for example, and whatever the password is, and Sharperlight will work with that. If you have some sort of issue with authentication, you're basically not going to see those datasets come up. Okay, that's authentication. Next we'll go to how we can load data into Tableau. So here we have Tableau, and it has a connections add link. So if we click on that, we've got a choice of all different types of databases and file formats that we can work with. And let's click on more, and then from there we can choose a file. And if we look at the filter list, it accepts CSV files. And if we've prepared a CSV file from Sharperlight, what we can do is click on the file, and it essentially loads the file. But how do we get the file, the CSV file, in a format that's ready for Tableau to load? Well, the best, or I think the easiest way to do that is to schedule a job in Sharperlight to create the file for you. So here I've got Scheduler, and I've created a schedule, and under Actions I've clicked New, and there's lots of different actions you can use, but in this case I said take the published report and save it as a CSV file. So in here I just choose the report I want to save as CSV from the list, and come down to CSV at the bottom and put in the file path for where that file is to be created. There is the ability to create file names with parameters, so you can put a date timestamp or other things in there, but we're just keeping it simple for this example. If this was Power BI, what we could have done is use the OneDrive folder location to drop the file in there, and that will be synchronized up to the cloud, and Power BI could read off that. But because we've got Personal Gateway, we don't really need to use the OneDrive drop location to upload it, but it is there if you need it. So we've specified a CSV file format. Let's press OK. It's saying that I don't have any triggers because this is just training, but if we wanted to, we could come over here and create a trigger so that it's refreshed every hour or every day, something like that. So let's just delete that trigger because we're going to manually do this. So we'll press OK, and what we'll do now is just execute that. So we manually force it to update. If we refresh Tableau, you see that the date and time has now changed. Since we're on the topic of scheduling, we could also create a job to refresh the Materialised query. That was another way of getting data into Tableau or Power BI. So if I look at this schedule job, you see that the action is different. What we're doing is selecting Materialised query table, and then from the list we browse for the Materialised query database and then the table. So essentially we're saying every day or every hour the trigger is fired and the Materialised query table will be updated, and then Tableau and Power BI will use a database connection to just simply query that table. In those scenarios, just be mindful of date filters and period filters, for example. They are relative date filters so that you're not hard coding particular dates into your data sets, and that way your data sets can refresh and maybe just grab the last 3 months or the last year. So that's been a basic overview of how to take data from Sharperlight and integrate it into Power BI and Tableau. The same principles can be applied to other applications as well.